My name is Roger Epp. I'm a member of the Political Science Department here. I am not John Esposito, and I am the person, some of you will know this, but I am also the person who has to say at the start of this panel that Professor Esposito is unable to be here. He took ill yesterday before he boarded his flight, and so that's a disappointment to me on the one hand. I remember at the very start of my own scholarly career when he was one of those rare and brave people in North America writing about the intersection of religion and international politics, and has done that for a very long time. So we hope he is well. I remember once going to a conference myself to arrive, I was just telling Mustafa this, arrive late at night through a snowstorm and have a message awaiting me at the hotel reception desk that said, "Emergency, call this number," which makes you think of the worst possibilities. Well, the worst possibility that night was that the keynote speaker wasn't going to get there the next morning from Colorado, and would I be the keynote speaker at 8 in the morning? So this is the nightmare of every academic. We have in place for you instead what I think will be a real treat. We have 4 distinguished panelists who have agreed to go on unscripted and initiate a conversation about contemporary Middle Eastern politics. The relatively unscripted question, or the very unscripted question, will be simply what dimension, what element of contemporary Middle Eastern politics are we missing, or what element has been consistently underplayed in our understanding of the region and its place in the world?
Bear with me, since this is a conversation that is going to probably provoke a little bit of controversy, but if I may, because of the expertise on this panel, one of the things that, and I appreciate the question because it's really about trying to shake us to try and find what are the elements of the Middle East and Arab Spring, which is something we're obviously all very interested in, that is neglected. In my opinion, it's really the role of agency, and I'm surrounded by these great historians and others in this room who are very familiar with the broad structural patterns emerging in the globe today. And this is not to say they don't matter. Colonialism matters, neocolonialism, capitalism, globalization. But one of the things that kind of, I think, troubles me is that it really diminishes the role of agency of those who went to the streets, those who decided to take the bullhorn, as they say, and go and demonstrate. And that, I think, is further dehumanizing the Arab people, and we need to be conscious of that, because I think we know from all the research of philosophers to contemporary analysts, we know that this process of dehumanizing the Arab world is way too prevalent. And I hope that one of the things that we can do is really remember who instigated the uprisings, why they sustained it. And to be quite frank, I know that as analysts and as perhaps as historians, philosophers, political scientists, and others, we want to explain things, and so we start from this very macro level. But we do a disservice, I think, sometimes too, and we also forget who is behind these uprisings. And one of the things, for example, I have to remind us, when we think of, whether it was Tunisia, whether it was Egypt, Libya, etc., there were no signs saying down with globalization, down with neoliberalism, down with Zionism. All the isms that we too often refer to in a theoretical sense, that wasn't their concern. Their concern was very much about day-to-day issues, right? It was about the fact that they were increasingly educated, they were cosmopolitan, they were well-versed with what's going on in the world, and they had regimes that basically continued to think that they could dupe them, as they had for 30, 40 years. And that, I think, is part of the awakening. I actually like the term awakening, because it wasn't so much that the light bulb went off for many Arabs who went to the streets. It was that they said enough. And not only enough, but that fear factor that you'd always held over us for decades. It's not enough this time. We realize that the genie's out of the bottle when we realize that actually when we go out en masse, you fear us. And that's a really, I think, important point that gets too often overlooked as analysts, as academics in our, I don't want to say ivory tower, but when we sort of stand back, and we have the luxury of being in the West here, many of us, and stand back and look at the events of what's going on and can explain this all in terms of isms, we do a disservice to those on the ground. And that's one of the things that I hope we can try and kind of tease out for the next 2 days, because we need to talk about those individuals. And there's some fantastic things. I mean, Juan and I were talking earlier. If I may, brag, I loved Juan's book. The New Arabs is a fantastic book. And if I may plug my own story, I have a book on Arab youth that's coming out in the next 2 days. And it's called Arab Dawn. And it's about the stories of individual young Arabs who went to the street, who protested, and who, what was the trigger that made them choose to do that, fantastic activity or act to go out and protest? And it wasn't those isms. I know we can as analysts go back and try and find those patterns, but for them it was the fact that they are educated, they got the top marks in their class, and they know that they're not going to be able to get the job because there's a corrupt individual that has to make sure that his family is appointed first before they get in the job. It's the fact that they have been working hard and doing all the things that we were told by governments to do, which is, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, get out there, be entrepreneurial, get educated. Part of our problem as an Arab world is that we, don't have high quality education and all the sort of excuses that are put on them. Well, they did that. They went out there, they got the scholarships, they did their masters. The number of young Arabs who have foreign degrees from the top universities, when I would go to the Middle East, it just, you can't help but feel that these young people are completely ignored as an asset to their country. They're viewed as a threat when they're a complete asset to their country. And that, I think, is part of the wake-up call. And I have to plug the historian Ted Gurr here, because I think he's the one that got it right from all the analysis of the Arab Spring in terms of the theoretical analysis. I mean, revolutionary theories abundant, but I think Ted Gurr got it right, which is this idea that they just felt that they deserved better. It's that relative deprivation concept, right? That they woke up and said, wait a minute, I've been doing all the right things and I'm not getting ahead and I deserve better. And that's really an important, psychological kind of break that was made. And this is important to point out because if we look at the indicators, again, the simple quantitative indicators, socioeconomically they were doing better. Unemployment was going down. GDP growth rate, which is never an indicator of success. I mean, I have to give that granted, even as a political economist, that was going up. But even though some of those, inequality measures, technically they were doing better, but it's the idea that they felt they deserved better, right? That it wasn't enough what was being delivered to them in terms of government. Governments were not keeping up with their demands, which was, I am an educated, cosmopolitan individual, and you can't make me out to be a threat. And part of that conversation is that they are people of faith. And this is another component that we kind of have also skirted over. But it's this idea that so many, and I can't help but feel that I see this throughout the Middle East today, which is these are many Arabs who are of faith, who do believe in Islam, who do believe that's an important part of their life, and they're being made out to be a threat by virtue of having more faith. And that is part of this conversation that I think when we talk about the Middle East, I hope we can bring it back to those individuals who went out to protest and keep that in mind from the bottom up. Keep that in mind as we get to the sort of big macro picture.
The question that was asked of us is what's not in the headlines? What's the big story here that's being missed? And that leads me really in a direction that we wouldn't be allowed to talk about on television, which is epistemology and how we know what we know and how we position things. And the keynote of the reporting on the events in the Middle East since 2011 has been religion and religious ethnicity. And so the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and then its abrupt demotion by the generals there, the devolution of the Syrian revolution into civil war, and the dramatic events in Iraq over the past year and a half have all been positioned as Sunni Shiite or fundamentalist versus quote-unquote secular. Those are the terms in which the reporting and the analysis has tended to be done, especially in Washington, D.C. And while it would be silly to deny that that these elements of identity politics are important in these developments, they, in my view, don't drive anything. They're not what's causing anything to happen. They are symptomatic of other developments. And so in a situation like Syria, where the state collapsed, and in the process of collapsing also lashed out at the young people who were demonstrating and attacked them. In Daraa, in the south, there were young people who the regime accused of being terrorists, and they actually held a demonstration one day in which they held up signs saying, we're not terrorists, we're youth. And the response of the regime was to drop tanks and fire tank shells into their midst. And what would you do if your regime did that to you? Well, they picked up a gun. And when they picked up a gun, it turned into a civil war. And once it became a civil war, then things begin to polarize with regard to the mobilization of cultural resources. So how would you get other people in Daraa or in Homs to join you in your now determination to violently overthrow this regime? Well, they're Sunnis, so you might say, we're being oppressed by Alawites. Then you would deploy this rhetoric. Or you would be forced to find support. Where would you find it? You would find it in your family, in your network of friends. Those would be more likely to be primordial in their characteristics. And so the polarization of the civil war drove people to a rhetoric of Sunni Shiite, even though in Syria, to see Syria through this lens is just crazy. Because, first of all, Syria is only 60% Sunni Arab. And of the 60% that are Sunni Arab, I don't think large numbers of those believe in God or pray or, to see them as Sunni, the Baathis, for instance, the secular people in Aleppo and Damascus, to code them as Sunni fighting, is and a good half of them sided with the regime, which is why the regime hasn't fallen. It's impossible that the minorities are keeping it alive. There's 10% of Syrians are Kurds, and they in the northeast have just declared neutrality for the most part, and that they are Sunnis is also not pertinent, because I don't know how to describe to you what they are. They, in the early 20th century, we had those wobblies, the workers on the far left, and the FBI or the Pinkertons kind of did them in. But I think that the Kurds in Syria are wobblies. They're far left, pro-worker, feminist. They also have an element of Kurdish nationalism, but to talk about them in the terms of Sunni and Shiite, it's just what planet are these people living on that do this? So looking at, and then a good 5% of Syrians are Eastern Orthodox Christians. And the Eastern Orthodox Church in Russia is aware of this, and it's one of the reasons the Russians are involved. It's a hearkening back to 19th century imperial religious politics. That's not what's going on in Syria. And then the so-called Shiites, the majority of them, 14% of the population, are Alawite Shiites, whom the Twelver Shiites who predominate in Iraq and Iran don't see them as Muslim, much less as fellow Shiites. So the idea that Hezbollah, for instance, which is a Twelver Shiite organization in southern Lebanon and eastern Beirut, intervened in Syria to help its fellow Shiites. I mean, this is bizarre. They were giving fatwas against them as infidels not long ago. They didn't. They don't think they're Muslim. They're intervening for realpolitik reasons, and so to see something like Syria through this religious lens and a bipolar religious lens of Sunni and Shia, it just does so much damage to the realities on the ground that it makes it impossible actually to understand what's going on. Now, yes, primordial identities are being talked about and a rhetoric of them is being deployed, but that's not what caused this to happen. What caused this to happen was that the Ba'ath regime is a Stalinist regime, and it didn't deal well with rivals or criticism, and it deployed massive violence against the young people who tried to rise up against it, and mainly were demanding that the regime go to free and fair elections. So in 2011, this regime had a choice. It could do what a lot of the Eastern European communist regimes did, which is just to open it up and compete as one party among many. And if they had done that, everything could have been avoided. But they didn't do it. And moreover, they might have won if they had had elections in 2011. It's not entirely clear that who would the Christians have voted for, who would the Alawites have voted for, et cetera, et cetera. They might well have at least gotten a plurality in parliament. So this decision, they rounded people up and put them in prison in the thousands, and once they were in prison, they tortured them to death. They boiled them. We have the pictures. The pictures came out. It's incredible to me. People talk about, could Bashar al-Assad somehow stay in power? I mean, this is a mass murderer. We don't let serial killers walk the streets. This guy has been responsible for not just dropping barrel bombs on kindergartens and killing people and so forth, but actually the people who were helpless in his prisons, he was torturing them to death. And this was not just to get information out. It was performative. It was to send the message that don't mess with the regime. Yes, also another problem is, and I agree with Bessma, and I'm stopping here, but I agree with Bessma that local agencies shouldn't be taken away from these people. Yes, it's true, the Russians intervened, and Hezbollah intervened, and the Americans intervened, and Saudi Arabia intervened, and so forth. But I lived in Lebanon during the Civil War, and that's what happens in civil wars. People, the Americans went to fight for the left in the Spanish Civil War. This always happens. You attract foreign supporters and detractors, and they try to play politics. Once you're divided, it's easy to get in there. But that's not also what's driving things to happen. I mean, I think a lot of ISIL's resources were local, and that local element of it, and trying to understand what exactly is happening. And let me just finish by saying that the way forward in Syria is not to throw up our hands, not to just condemn one side or another, or one foreign interference or another, is to start imagining ways of going forward and of ultimate national reconciliation. Syria is very unlikely to split up. Its constituent parts probably can't be viable. And if you think about South Africa or even post-World War II Europe, massive violence, massive evil has nevertheless been overcome, transcended in various ways. New arrangements have been gotten. And that's what we have to think forward for Syria.
I want to join my voice to what Bessma and Juan said. And very shortly to start by telling you about a story which is related to what I'm going to say. Last year, at the same time, in October 2014, I was in Prague and for a conference on the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I was in a panel, I was sharing a panel with Amr Moussa, ex-Secretary General of the Arab League, as you know. And Amr Moussa came out with a new paradigm for the Middle East, and he said, well, you know, everyone around the Middle East has to have, as we had Sisi in Egypt, you need to have the same paradigm of military coup in order to fight against the fanatics, the fundamentalists, and that's the only way that we can do that. Now, I wanted to start with that because this story actually shows what I want to say, which is the fact that, Arab Spring brought with it a lot of the democratic wills and wishes, a lot of wishes and good wishes from the suffering populations, but at the same time, it exposed the lack of, I would say, democratic experience, both on the side of the civic actors, but also a deeply rooted autocratic, I would say, psychology that you find in people like Amr Moussa when he comes and he supports the paradigm of somebody like Sisi, actually. So if we have to talk about what went wrong and what don't we talk about actually in the news very often, we know by fact, for those of us who are either working on the Middle East or coming from the Middle East, who have lived the Arab Spring, the Green Movement in Iran, I would add also the Turkish movement of Gezi Park to it and what's happening in Turkey today. We know that, despite the fact that there was a historical significance actually to this social mobilization, this political mobilization in the Middle East, it was not sufficient to create a sustainable democracy in the region. And partly I think that it had to do with several elements. One of it is certainly has to do with, in some of these countries, with the exception of what we saw in Tunisia, and I believe that also in Iran we can say that, despite the fact that the Green Movement did not win, we had weak civic institutions to fight back, and also weak, I would say, secular candidates to fight back against either the fundamentalists or against the militaries. But that's not the whole story. I think we have to go beyond that. And it has to do also with the fact that, for us coming from the Middle East, we know that the region is certainly fascinated, especially I'm talking about this autocratic psychology, fascinated by fear creating, money making, and power keeping. These three elements, actually, you find it practically everywhere. Of course, I would add male chauvinism also to it. The fact that women are always absent from power, something that you don't see in the Indian subcontinent, for example, when you compare it with the Middle East. But there is another point which none of us have been talking about, and I risk to talk about it because I think it's quite important. And that has to do with something which is not happening in the Middle East, but is happening in the West. And it's having its implications and consequences in the Middle East. And that's the fact that we're witnessing, and Canada is a good example of it, with the shallow politics that we have in this country. It's the absence of democratic passion in our world, especially in the West. And the fact that we are getting, the democratic passion is not there anymore, mostly in the Western societies. The implications, we see it also when there are movements, social movements and political movements in somewhere else in the world, either in the Middle East or somewhere else. And I think this idea of passion is very important to talk about. Last night, Tariq Ali was talking about the consequences of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union and its satellites. And he's told us that it left us with the domination of one empire, something which was historically never there since the antiquities. I would add another consequence to it that he didn't talk about. And the true consequence, which is very closely related to the failure of the Arab Spring, and we are here to talk about it and say why is it an unfinished project, has to do with the downfall of the democratic passion in the West. Don't look at yourselves as some radicals and subversives. We are considered as radicals and subversives, but I would say especially by the establishments around the Western world. But I think that the illusion which has been given to us by liberal oligarchies, I would call that, is that, the fall of the Berlin Wall left us with a good model, and we don't need any more democratic passion, and we just follow that, or we have it packed in London, Paris, Ottawa, or Washington, and we send it to Kabul, Damascus, Baghdad, or Tehran, and as soon as they open it, the genie is going to come out and the democracy is going to play out. And we saw that that's not the case, actually, and it didn't work out this way. So I think that one of the elements when I say that there is an absence of democratic passion, and we see it when it's somewhere else in the world is playing and we cannot react to it as we have to react to it. There are two elements there, and I invite you to think about that. One element is that instead of talking, as we were doing it, about human sufferings and have empathy towards these human sufferings of people around the Middle East, we talk about humanitarian intervention, which most of the time is equivalent of military invasions. So the language is already there. We talk about humanitarian intervention and not empathy towards human sufferings. Second element is the element of the fact that because of the absence of the democratic passion that we see, instead of taming violence, we become producers of violence, and we actually add to that. I mean, humanitarian intervention is a good example of not taming violence, but producing violence in the Middle East. And I think that, if I have to finish on that, I think that, and I wrote a piece on that, the new refugee crisis that we see in Europe, and the lack of empathy that you see around Europe, coming especially from I would say the States, but sometimes from the actors themselves and sociological actors around Europe and around the West, it has to do with what I'm talking about, with the loss of this democratic passion. And this loss of democratic passion actually, I think, has to do directly with the erosion of the public space in the West, which has its consequences in the Middle East. Because when there is a civic movement, and when there is an intellectual movement, when there's a youth movement, and it has to be supported by people outside, it's not supported as it has to be. So they just leave it as it is. Thank you.
I'm not going to repeat what I said last night, so I'll just restrict myself to a few comments on what colleagues have said on this table, around this table. The notion that the Arab Spring and the way it erupted was totally spontaneous, I think is only partially correct. I think what triggered it off, as we know full well, in Tunisia, which was the first country, was a single event, which was a shopkeeper, poor shopkeeper, setting himself on fire. That in itself became a huge event, an image which could be seen, but obviously on its own was not the reason. You had growing unemployment, very large-scale youth unemployment, poverty, at the same time as you had a corrupt oligarchic elite making a huge amount of money, which the whole country knew. And that event finally brought things to the surface. It's always the way that deep social grievances, political grievances, come to the top when something happens, and then people say enough is enough. You're absolutely right about that. The question is, where then? And that we can't ignore. Where does the movement go then? And here the point I was making about Egypt yesterday is that the left and the liberals and progressive people basically had no alternative to the Brotherhood. And talking about the Brotherhood, I talk about it as a political movement which goes back a long, long time and which has branches all over the Arab world. It's been persecuted. I mean, some of the most brutal tortures in Egypt carried out certainly after the assassination of Sadat, but even before that, were against the Brotherhood. Their people were tortured, in many cases killed, and so this became an oppositional force par excellence. It doesn't mean you have to agree. I don't agree with them politically, but one has to recognize what the reality is. And so when the time came for the elections, they were voted through, and then we know what happened. I mean, this appalling dictatorship was imposed, etc., etc. Second point related to that, which I've written about many times, is when do people lose their fear? Because that's the key to every revolutionary upheaval, that people are not afraid to die and say, come what may, we're going to achieve A, B, or C, and if they kill us, let them. And that stage was reached in Egypt when it became very clear that people were prepared to die. And we saw mainly images from Cairo and the square. Very few images were shown of large working class towns where factories were occupied, where workers came out onto the streets, joining everyone else. For 3 days, 3 whole days, Alexandria was without a government, without a state. The security forces were driven out. And that raises the question of why didn't they go beyond that? Why didn't they take Alexandria? Why didn't they make it a model city, saying this is how we're going to run the city? It's partially a lack of politics, and of course the Brotherhood was dominant, and they were not interested in taking a city like that and showing what sort of a government we want to do. It didn't occur to them. They were after the whole country. So that movement, I mean, all of these things, all of these uprisings had some things in common and some things which were very specific to the country concerned. Juan says that the Sadat regime was a Stalinist, torturous regime, but this is true of most of the Arab states. Regardless of the scale of the torture, they all employ torture. And after 9/11, some of these regimes were used by the United States to torture people they felt they couldn't torture themselves. Pakistan, Afghanistan, people were sent to be tortured there. So this is not a big secret. And in the case of Syria, I mean, one of the worst massacres that took place under the regime of Bashar Assad's father, Hafiz al-Assad, was in fact where tens of thousands of people were killed in Hama, and they were mainly Brotherhood people. So it's not a case, I think, that Syria was, virgin territory in the political sense. There were groups there, there were people there. Syria had the left was, of course, very small in my opinion, though they exaggerated their strength. The big force in Syria was also the Brotherhood. Third point, despite all what was going on in these countries, I mean, one cannot ignore, especially in the world in which we live, the fact that the United States and its allies constitute dominant powers. It's not just local. It becomes international the minute it is decided that US interests are threatened or Israeli interests are threatened one way or the other. And one appeal, I would make to you, which is that when we're talking about the Middle East, in whatever capacity, Israel is now part of that Middle East. Can't be ignored. It should be referred to and discussed as such. It may have come to, its formation was determined by outside forces largely. That we know, but it is now part and parcel of the Middle East, as anyone who travels to that world knows. So we can't ignore it. And this whole nonsense which was talked for a long, long time, that Israel is a model democracy which the Arabs should follow. I mean, it's an ethnic democracy, for God's sake. It's like telling the Africans you should follow the South African model of apartheid. That sort of democracy, because whites did have the vote. They did have the rights, as Israeli Jews do. So one has to stop effectively pushing Israel out of the picture. It's part of the picture, and many, many settlements take place. I mean, the fact that it's been bombing Syria for the last few years has only come out because the Russians are there, and they're doing a deal with the Israelis and the Americans, saying, let's not make sure our planes don't crash into each other, or we don't pick up a fight by accident. So the Syrian situation, however it started, and it started as a democratic uprising, is now beyond that stage. All the big powers are in there. The United States, the Russians have made an intervention, the Iranians are there, and always with Syria. And this is, Juan is right, it doesn't have much to do with what their religion is, it's the alliances. That Hezbollah was armed by Syria, so it became a huge thing for the Israelis to remove this regime or get a different regime in with whom they could talk. The Iranians didn't want Saudi influence to spread further, and that's what they feared, and they've been backing this regime. It's for geopolitical reasons, and that is still going on. I'm not as confident as Juan called that Syria will not split. I think the way things are moving in the Middle East, this is what is going on. And Syria has been split once before. At the time, soon after the French founded it, and Lebanon was created. And heaven knows that if there is one peoples in the Arab world which really deserves independence and a national state, it's the Kurds. They've been waiting for years and years and years. They've been crushed by virtually all the governments. And they might get a state. They might not, because there are lots of contradictions which arise. The Turks are completely opposed to it. As you see what Erdogan is doing in Turkey today, it's a total war on the Kurds. It's appalling what is going on there, and not much discussed, because it doesn't suit the needs of the people who rule the world. So I think the Middle East is being remade, and I think it's being remade in a particular way. And the only good thing that might come out of it is if the Kurds get a state. We can hope. I'm not 100% confident of this, but certainly the Syrian Kurds, and to a large extent the Turkish Kurds, today are probably the most progressive forces in that region. The Iraqi Kurds used to be to a certain extent, but it's largely tribal, whereas the Kurdish organizations in Turkey and in Syria are very political and have been very progressive on many issues, not just gender, but working with minorities. Not an accident that many minorities went to Syrian Kurdistan to seek refuge. So whether Syria can be put together again, I hope it can, but like I hope Iraq can. Because I think creating small states ultimately will lead nowhere. It creates more problems, with the exception of the Kurds. Whether it will happen, I don't know.